group. Your attention, they're going to tell us about the lost cosmonaut.
So our topic today is the lost cosmonaut. Our group members are Naman, myself, Connor, and Yash, and more specifically the Tory Bird recordings. So officially, Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space. She went to space in 1963. She was Soviet, but two Italian brothers tapped into Soviet communications in 1961, and they claimed to have heard a Russian on a spaceship. She is speaking Russian, calling for help, and saying that her spaceship is on fire. The Soviets, of course, deny the authenticity of this, but this led the world to believe that Soviets were doing undercover operations on their space program, and this led to many conspiracy theories. So the world politics at the time of 1960s, as we're in the middle of the Cold War, the USSR and the USA are currently fighting against each other, but never really fighting. They just do a bunch of proxy wars. The Cold War started mostly because communism and capitalism, according to the USSR and USA, they believed that those two cannot coexist in the world. So the USSR distrusted the USA's use and possession of the atomic bomb. USSR mistrusted capitalism, and overall that led to just spying between the two countries, and that also led to an arms race to see who could build up the larger nuclear arsenal, and also led to a space race. And in the space race, there were two main differences between the two programs that were going on. One is the Soviet Union, and they wanted to have all of their operations being secret, undercover. They had no press releasings on any of them, whereas the USA had many press releasings. They were very open about what was going on, and they were very proud about their space program. The USSR sent the first satellite to space, which was Sputnik, and they sent the first man to space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. And USA followed by sending a man to space, Alan Shepard, in 1961, only a month later. And USSR also sent the first woman to space.
Okay, so the Giudica Cordiglia brothers, these are the two Italian brothers who were responsible for getting the recording of this woman asking for help in space. They basically began listening or being interested in radios and stuff when they were teenagers, and developed a technology that could track satellites in space and rotate and move with them, and so it could just record any signals that they left off to all these mission bases on Earth. And their goal was in the middle of the Cold War, so they wanted to listen in how the USA and the USSR were doing on the race to space, and they mainly focused on the USSR because there was very little information about what they were doing, so they were trying to discover what they were doing. Okay, so they built a technology, and it was basically a giant satellite dish type of thing, and it was called the Tory Bird, and it was in Italy, or the first one that recorded this, and it would take the signals, block out the background noise, and move with the satellite as it orbited the Earth. They had also a lot of meters and instruments and stuff that they created that were really similar to NASA's, and they had no official technological knowledge and education, but they say they could do all this stuff, translate it, record these things from super far away, which in the 60s was nearly impossible. So there's a lot of conspiracy behind that. And the Zeus network, after this recording, or their first Tory Bird station, they made 16, I think, of these stations all across the Earth, so it could track things, it would never lose track of them. At any point on Earth, it could just always be tracking it. And yeah, their sister knew Russian for some reason. She was able to translate this specific recording.
Right, so these brothers released a series of 9 recordings over a 4-year span, and pretty much all of them were in some way posing a sort of a conspiracy theory against the USSR space program. So the first one of the first recordings they released was in November 1960, when they released a recording of seemingly tapping in Morse code. and you could hear the sound sort of diminishing, sort of hinting that the spaceship was moving away from the Earth. And since officially the first man in space was Yuri Gagarin, who, as he said, went to space only in April of 1961, this posed a really sort of a pressing question as to whether the USSR had sent a man to space even before this. Another recording that they released was of a dying cosmonaut, his heartbeat and final breaths, and they actually got professional doctors to sort of ratify their statements by saying that in fact was a man's dying breaths. But perhaps the most famous of these recordings was the recording of the Russian woman that we're about to listen to, and this is called The Lost Cosmonaut. So without further ado. And that goes on for 2.5 minutes, where she is asking someone to listen to her, to respond to her. And this is a translated transcript that was released online, where she's basically saying that, listen, come in, trying to somehow establish this sort of connection to ground control, saying that she's breathing oxygen, but she's also very hot at the same time because the spaceship is probably lighting on fire. And as the recording sort of progresses, towards the end of the recording, you can actually hear her from where she was calm initially. She sort of becomes a lot more panicked as the recording goes on, and starts to literally plead to be heard towards the end. And in the end, she just says, "I will attempt to re-enter." So where's the conspiracy in this, right? It seems pretty cut and dry. There's a recording of a woman speaking Russian. It seems like the USSR was in fact hiding something, but like Connor mentioned earlier, the brothers had no sort of technical knowledge about building listening devices or anything of the sort. And so as soon as this recording was released, the USSR immediately came out and said that the brothers were frauds and that they had somehow defrauded this recording and released a fake. But the West was quick to believe the brothers because they would pretty much believe anything that they thought would bring even a slight destabilization to the communist regimes. And so this sparked off a worldwide debate that, if you believe it or not, goes on even today.
Alright, so the primary support for the lost cosmonaut theory comes from a press release just 3 days after the brothers had allegedly taken the recordings of the lost cosmonauts. This famous Soviet press agency TASS reported the return to the Earth a large unmanned spacecraft the size of a city bus, and this spacecraft had burned upon attempting re-entry into the Earth. Its purpose was unknown and its launch had not been previously disclosed. And so this led people to theorize that this may have been in fact a secretly planned mission by the Soviets, and they were trying to cover up the death of the cosmonauts. And the launch of the spacecraft was not announced by the Soviets, so there was a quick anti-Soviet sentiment around the USSR, because they were they had not given the
A very secret.
Yeah, and so as we know, the USSR and the US had they had the space race in the 60s, and the USSR was very secretive about their space missions, and this led people to theorize that the USSR was very secretive because they would attempt many dangerous missions just to get a foothold in the space race, and these missions may have involved the death of cosmonauts and astronauts, and this may have been one of the missions. And so according to this theory, the launch took place on May 16th, 1961, just 11 days after Yuri Gagarin set foot on space. And it's not known what went wrong during the flight, but people theorize that the thermal shield of the capsule may have been damaged upon launch, and hence upon attempting re-entry into the Earth, the capsule may have been burnt. And anti-Soviet sentiment led people to support that the theory that the USSR space program was in fact highly. Okay, so the primary criticism for the theory comes from the lack of the technical know-how of the brothers. In the 60s, both the US and the UK had high-tech intelligence devices and agencies which could track down every move made by the Soviets. And it is known that the US would do everything possible to try to destabilize the Soviet Union to get a foothold in the space race. Yet, all these high-tech devices could not capture a communication signal between the USSR and the spacecrafts. But when these brothers, through their relatively low-tech and handmade devices, captured the signals which the high-tech devices of the US and UK couldn't, people questioned the authenticity of these recordings. And so in some of these lost cosmonaut theory recordings, we hear the words, "We are veering off Earth's orbit." Now, this was not possible during the early 1960s because it was not possible for a spacecraft to accidentally veer off Earth's orbit. Because for this to happen, they would have needed a certain escape velocity, and engines during the early 60s were not nearly as powerful enough to accidentally veer off Earth's orbit. And so when the Soviets during the early 60s announced the development of their two most technologically advanced spacecrafts, the Sputnik and the Vostok, these could hold only one member. Yet in this recording, we can clearly hear the words "we," which suggests that there was more than one member in the spacecrafts, which again led people to question the authenticity of these recordings. Okay, so both the primary support and the primary criticism, both the primary support of the cosmonaut theory and the primary criticism comes from an analysis of the recording. The supporters for the theory say that the woman initially starts off calm and collected, as was expected of the cosmonauts and astronauts. And then she starts to show a bit of panic because as she receives no response. And the critics say that there was no possible way for a woman to act that calm and collected in the wake of a potential death and fire. But the biggest critic for this theory comes from the fact that she speaks Russian but with an Italian accent. And it is a known fact that the Soviet space program during the 60s only sent people with well-educated native Russian backgrounds. So people again question the authenticity of these claims. And yeah.
Right. So one of the things that we were discussing while researching for this was that in many ways this sort of conspiracy is pretty similar to the conversation in the way that they both stem out of the privacy of sound. For example, Harry Saul, he was a professional, built his own sort of mechanism for listening into conversations. Similarly, the Cordelias, even though they weren't professionals, they claimed to have built their own way to tap into communications from spacecrafts to ground control. But the primary difference rises from where Harry did not act when he actually figured out what the recording was about. He sort of kept it to himself and tried to see what he himself could do. The Cordelias did not hesitate to make their findings public, and so they sort of, instead of keeping it to themselves, they sort of brought it out for the world to see. So, it's been 50 years since this whole sort of conspiracy took place, and there still continues to be a lot of debate about it. There's a lot of podcasts that have been released since. There's people who've written full research papers on this, both in support and in criticism of the theory. There's been so many conspiracy theories. Like one person even says that the brothers got their sister, who knew Russian, to just speak as a cosmonaut, blurred the recording and released it to the world, saying that it was a Russian woman. And linguistic experts sort of backed that there was a slight Italian accent to the way the woman was speaking Russian. But even after 50 years, there's no sort of concrete evidence as to whether the recording was a fake or whether the death of the cosmonauts actually happened. So we're leaving it up to you to decide, did these deaths actually happen and were covered up as part of the Soviet propaganda, Or was this just an attempt from the Cordelia brothers to have their 15 minutes of fame? These are some of the sources that we use.
What do you guys think, based on your research?
I'd say the Soviets were pretty suspect.
You what?
I'd say the Soviets were pretty suspect.
We're pretty suspect? You think it was an actual recording?
Yeah, I think it was
Okay.
an actual recording.
What about, was there sort of, for the other recordings, were those sort of,
Most of them were shot down kind of immediately. The SOS to the world that they recorded initially, November 1960, a lot of people claim that that could have been done pretty much anywhere, even in like a sort of a classroom situation, if you will, just sort of tapping and having the recording device moving away, sort of giving it that Doppler effect. So that was shot down immediately. The one that gained the most sort of popularity after the Lost Cosmonaut one was the one where they heard the dying heartbeat of a cosmonaut, because they actually had a sort of medical basis to that. They brought in their father, who was a doctor, and he sort of backed their theory that it was in fact a human's heartbeat. They actually started off, the first recording ever was the first dog that went into space, Laika. They recorded that, and so that sort of formed the basis for their credibility, if you will. But after that, people started raising a lot of questions about them, because most of their devices were also handmade, so compared to the high-tech and like professionals that the USA and UK were probably hiring two brothers in the middle of nowhere.
Have they ever proven that they could ever pick up anything from space with their devices?
Like I said, they recorded the first dog, and that was pretty, like everyone pretty much agreed that that was in fact an actual recording.
Were
because,
there
like,
other transmissions of the first dog in space? Like, wasn't that public?
I don't think it was made public, because that was also kind of sent to the Soviet Union, so they kind of had all the transmissions to themselves. But the recording of the first dog too was released like during this actual flight, so it was before anything could have been made public. So there's actually the website lostcosmonauts.net, which they have all the 9 recordings that they took, and sort of have their versions of the theories there.
other group members, you guys agree with Naman?
I disagree.
And tell us.
I think it's kind of sketch that the 2 recordings that gained the most fame was the one with the doctor, and the doctor was their dad.
Right,
And then the
that's
one
what
that they
that's what I
had,
was asking him, I'd get it.
and then the one where they had this one where they had their sister as their main source. Like they had outside sources, maybe that would seem, but it seems weird that the main sources of credibility were from their own family.
How did you guys hear about this?
Just trying to come up with a topic, just scrolling everywhere.
Okay.
Stumbled
But
across
no,
it.
you guys hadn't heard it before, you.
No, I hadn't heard about it before.
What was, okay, so, Tory Burr, was that the name of the location?
Yeah, it was an abandoned German bunker in Italy, and that's kind of where they set up their whole operation initially, and then they sort of expanded to a worldwide sort of
The
scale.
place is called Tory Burr, but these recordings are like referred to as the Tory Burr recordings.
Yeah, because they all sort of came from there.
Yeah. And so when they switched like the Zeus network, I mean, so were any of their other recordings ever, I guess, substantiated from another location, or is everything sort of like, they recorded, they're the only source for it, so?
I don't think they sort of released where they got the recordings from, but it would kind of make sense for them to come from different places at the same time. It's like satellites always moving around the world, it would be kind of difficult just to capture them from one place. I guess it would make sense for them to have come like, they set up the network in such a way that there was people in the Americas, people in Africa, in the Pacific, so it would sort of make sense just to have the recording coming from different places.
And the one of the Lost Cosmonaut, the date for that one was when?
The actual recording being released,
Yeah.
they dated it to May 23rd,
61?
61,
Okay.
which is like 12 days after the first man in space.
And when did they release it? Soon thereafter?
I think they released it later that year.
Okay.
So initially they dated it much later because they released it much later, but then when they realized that like immediately after this sort of recording was taken, the Russians released a statement saying that one of their big space shuttles burnt upon re-entry. They realized that it was probably the same thing, because she also says "we" a lot of times in the recording, hinting that there was more than one person, and since the space shuttle that crashed was the size of a city bus, so it definitely could have held more than one person. So that's-
Any other questions? Sam, go for it.
Can we do a group
vote?
Group vote? Sure, yeah. You lead it, Sam.
I leave. Which one should I start with? Or like, how are we gonna do?
Raise your hand.
Who thinks it was authentic recording the Russians? Is that what you're
Raise
asking?
your hand if you think that it actually happened and this is real.
Not any
Good job. Quick question though. So it crashed.
Not a right on the head.
So there were no survivors, right?
No,
Were any of the bodies recovered?
not that was reported.
So the question is, who believes the recording
Yeah,
is an
yeah.
authentic
Who, yeah.
record of a lost cosmonaut?
Pretty high temperature, they would still be stuck over.
Soviet thought.
Nana, didn't you believe it was?
Yeah, I
Okay,
did.
Nana's with you, so 3. 4, okay, a couple more. 4? Jake, okay. And then who believes it is inauthentic?
Vague.
Okay, the majority there, all right. Cool, any other questions? Give this group a round of applause.